A longitudinal study involves the same kinds of issues that a case study does, except that it is stretched over time. It is interested in answering the question, has there been any change over a period of time in a group, in a social situation, in the kinds of texts that are being produced by some institution or in some other unit of study. The general formula of a longitudinal study is the relationship between variables x and y in the unit under study, the same or different at time 1 and time 2. A good example of a longitudinal study done by sociologists is the study that was done in 2000 by Goiter, Guppy, and Thompson, who were looking at the evaluation of prestige of occupational titles specified as held by a man or a woman. And they were replicating in 2000 a 1970 study, a 1970 survey. Both surveys were collected in the Kitchener-Waterloo, Ontario area, while the 1975 data revealed an average of a 5-point advantage to men over women in terms of prestige. This gender gap had disappeared by the year 2000. In more people-oriented work, women are now accorded in 2000 higher prestige than men. So the paper looks to these social change and asks how they're linked with convergence over a quarter century in the sex typing of occupations. The 1975 study done in the Kitchener-Waterloo area looked at the movement of women into the labor force, which was well underway in most of Canada. In 1975, the participation rate of women in the labor force was 44% compared to 29% in 1961. So there was already a strong movement of women into the labor force, but it was a starkly segregated workforce, to use the phrase coined by one of my colleagues here at York, Pat Armstrong, and her husband, Hugh Armstrong. Occupational inequality between men and women certainly existed at this point. Women earned about 60% of what men earned. Women were being pushed into occupations with high educational demand, but with low income. And those occupations were accorded very low prestige. Even though high education was in demand, female labor in the 1970s was thought of as merely contributing secondarily to household economics, and household economics were anchored firmly around a male head of household who held a man's job with higher earnings, but often with less educational requirements and less skill requirements than were common with those held by women. Females dominated in occupations that were accorded less prestige than those dominated by men. In the original 1975 study, the authors also wanted to know what statuses assigned to the incumbents were, and not just statuses assigned to a specific occupation. What the researchers found was that when females were in a male-dominated occupation, the women were considered to be deviant and were accorded a much lower prestige than was given to males in the same occupation. So even though the occupations had high status, that status was only triggered if the incumbent was a male. If it was a female, she was accorded a much lower status. But by the year 2000, in a comparative analysis, notions about the incumbent remained important, but they seem to take on a new form. The researchers who did the 2000 study were able to note that whether or not the person answering their questions was male, female, young, old, rich, or poor, they perceived the typical woman incumbent as entitled to equal or greater social status than the typical man